Maybe we can start with a quick round of introductions, starting from Sam, just what you do and where you're at.
Test. Hi, I'm Sam Hart. So I have kind of a range of relevant experience to this panel. Long ago, I ran an art magazine and did curation for a number of New York-based art institutions. I also have a technical background, so I now work with Achilles on Forma through my capacity at Skip. I'm the head of product and strategy at Skip, and Skip does cross-chain infrastructure for sovereign chains, including art chains.
Yeah, I'm Jordan. I am the co-founder of Astria. In terms of how that's relevant, Forma is built on top of Astria's tech stack, and we've worked to help support them get to launch, this past month or so. Yeah.
I'm No Sleep John. I lead growth at Hyperlane, and how it's relevant to Forma is Forma uses the Hyperlane bridge and infrastructure to get all the TIA onto Forma.
Great. So all of you sort of work on different supplies and components to enable bespoke block spaces for various applications, right? Like both Hyperlane, Skip, and Astria all sort of want to support a multitude of rollups with different aims, different dispositions, different target demographics and audiences. And I guess one of the first questions that I would be curious to hear your perspective on is why do we need bespoke block spaces for different applications rather than stay on sort of, a different construction? Specifically, why would sovereign chains be interesting for creative use cases in particular?
Yeah, I think having a sovereign chain here is really exciting. It's especially around something like Forma, which is trying to create art and then community around that. It gives you a space that kind of, to really unite that in terms of like a community aspect. So I think that's cool for that. In terms of having multiple of these sovereign chains, I think it depends on what your use case is and what you're doing. In an exciting way, you can kind of have this idea of like time-based. You can have like ephemeral blockchains, whereas there's an event that you're doing something around, and you kind of have this space that you can do some sort of activity on just around that. Or it's exciting for the ability to ship something and iterate on it while still having the decentralization core of crypto underneath it. And yeah, I think the reality here is there's going to be a lot of things that will come out of this in the future, and we'll see more new use cases that I haven't thought of yet. But the goal of kind of what we're trying to provide at Astria by making it possible to make all of these roll-ups and these sovereign communities in space is really to foster more innovation, because it's relatively, we've been doing this for crypto for like a decade now, but there's still oftentimes this talk where are we going to find product market fit, where are we going to find users, and so providing a place where it's easy to innovate and test things out and actually get things to users without maybe having the financial implications of modifying a state machine that a whole bunch of people are relying on for real financial transactions is an exciting space.
Yeah, it's way easier to build your own sovereign chain than iterate on. I guess the sovereignty aspect is pretty cool because you get to control the direction of the chain design. So if you build on Solana, you have to go with the Solana design and their direction of development. With your own sovereign rollup or app chain, you get to control your VM design. You get to control different permissions, monetization. There's many more angles that you can customize there with your sovereign rollup. So.
Yeah, the reasons that are often told about sovereign block space are things like customizing the gas token that you want to use, slightly less relevant for sovereign rollups, but sovereign chains in general. Being able to leverage a different sequencer set or a specific set of sequencer rules, or just having very tight controls increasing the efficiency or just being kind of creative with the state machine. So experimenting with new VMs or doing some, I mean, in the artchain context, it's like you can literally do whatever. I mean, this whole event is about do whatever. It's like do something fucked up, actually. Like let's make something that's kind of broken and see what happens. So that actually opens a very interesting space for what a blockchain can be, and creative experimentation that can kind of unfold.
Is the sovereign component of the sovereign rollup, do you feel like that part is important for the experimentation, or is a non-sovereign rollup that sort of just settles on a smart contract like somehow more constrained, in your opinion?
I mean, it's slightly more constrained than a sovereign chain, but it's all trade-offs. I did another panel on Blockspace at one point specifically, and I kind of described Blockspace as it's like paper. Like paper comes in all different forms. Like sometimes paper is just paper. It's like printer paper or something like that. Like sometimes paper is like, the tool, like textured, embossed, whatever, and it's like, or it's stamped with it's notarized and it's incorporated into legal documents. Like now it's a kind of special type of paper. Like you could make, paper's good for a lot of different things. Like sometimes you kind of want to specialize and select the paper that makes sense for you. And yeah, a sovereign rollup is like, it has certain kind of common qualities. In your case, like you need to pay gas tokens in TIA. You could potentially abstract that with like an intermediary, but it has most of the capabilities that a sovereign chain does, but misses some elements that you might have access to if you had your own chain.
Yeah, I think that the idea of like a sovereign rollup versus I always just say a rollup with a canonical bridge. I don't know what the better term here is, but I think it's a little bit overblown because at the end of the day, you have sovereignty when you choose which type of rollup you want to make. And it's just about what suits best for your use case and instance. I think launching a sovereign rollup provides you a lot more flexibility down the road in terms of what you can do and how you can change. There's questions here of, like what is the social consensus of what truth is, and if you build a non-sovereign rollup, you're supposed to be dedicated to using that on-chain smart contract in the future. But if you don't do that, you can also make the sovereign choice of like, well, we're going to like fork away and that contract's no longer valid. So it's just a degree of like what works best for your use case and how easy it is to make a change.
Yeah, actually, like I wanted to ask you, like why sovereign rollups versus like an app chain or like just an Ethereum settled rollup? Like why would I do that?
Like, is that to me?
Yeah, to you.
Yeah, so I mean, in an Ethereum settled rollup, you get the benefit of having access to ETH liquidity. I think a sovereign rollup can provide different options in terms of what you're doing. It doesn't mean that you can't have ETH and you can't have access to that. It doesn't mean that you can't use things like Hyperlane in order to get bridging of whatever assets are important for you in your sovereign space. And I think back to the like ease of iterating, it's really about like, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to test. And when we do demos and whatnot, it's like, okay, here I'm going to test this on my local machine. I'm going to build some state. I'm going to do things, make sure it works. And then I'm going to, ship a version on mainnet and make sure that it works a little bit too. And then I'm going to go again, and you don't have to like redeploy contracts and figure out who's signing all of that, and it can be just a little bit easier to iterate through that design and process of launching.
And also, like you don't have to assemble a full validator set yourself, right? You get that from Celestia or whatever DA layer.
Yeah. You don't have to. I mean, in a traditional rollup space, you don't assemble a validator set either. I guess so. In comparison to an app chain, that's definitely the big lift. Sorry, I forgot about the app chain part there. Is that if you're building your own app chain, you can use something like Cosmos, and you can have IBC for different assets, but you have to go and wrangle validators. And not only do you need to bring the validators into your space, you likely require offering your own token at some point, which is maybe something you don't want to do. You additionally have to, once you get those validators on board, it's one thing to have people on board. It's another thing to keep them on board while you continue to run your chain, because they can make the decision like, this isn't economically viable for me anymore, or there's something else which is more economically viable. And so it becomes this weird like two-sided marketplace that you have to manage.
So Sam, you talked about sort of the notion of there being many different kinds of papers, sort of paper types, and that leads to a plethora of different rollup constructions. And we've seen that sort of explode over the last year, and even more so in the last 6 months, and probably even more so in the future. And there's been this association in crypto between the notion of sort of a rollup and a community, right? Like these things are almost used interchangeably. I'm personally very skeptical of the notion of a community, especially when it relates to NFT-esque situations. Usually it just means backholders want their images to be more expensive, and how do we arrange ourselves in a way where we can make that happen. That being said, I've noticed with Forma, for example, Forma in particular has some custom precompiles that mean that you can have fully on-chain metadata, right? Which means that like sort of an extra little thing there. And it seems to me like the deeper you enshrine rules on the logic of a chain, the more likely people are to coalesce around those rules and make creations that relate to these rules. And that might actually be the birthplace of a community that's viable in some respects, or like long-term oriented, right? So the more specialized with things you go, the more abilities you give to people to do things they couldn't do elsewhere, then maybe in that case the block space does become the shelling point for a community that's not just backholders, but people who are disposed to create in a particular way. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah. We were talking earlier, so I was kind of part of a community of very early blockchain art creators, and we were kind of not very interested in the idea of NFTs. We were kind of like, okay, you're gonna build this whole permissionless coordination system that has the ability for anyone in the world to like write and interact and like create rules with each other, and then you're just gonna put an image on there, and like I was just like didn't really make a lot of sense. I've come around to NFTs a bit. One, an NFT is just kind of a package. You can put different things in there. So the ERC 721 standard like allows for kind of injected logic. And if you kind of step back, like it's really just kind of an addressable object on chain. It kind of has some associated metadata, has a standard way of interfacing with markets and whatnot. And I kind of coming from, or like having experience in the art industry, one of the reasons that I was actually quite interested in working in crypto was the art industry has this really kind of perverse relationship with capital, where they're kind of like denying its existence or kind of critiquing it, but like then not. It's like all built around wealth and funded by wealthy patrons. And so I was like, this is kind of bullshit. Like, you're just not. It's disingenuous. Like, you should actually just like try to build systems that like engage directly with capital in order to like solve artist problems. And kind of caught myself with NFTs like having that same judgment, like, oh, these are kind of financialized things. Well, actually, like, yeah, that was kind of the point, is like we are pointing at the thing. This is the kind of capitalized object, and giving it value and like making it tradable. I think there are a lot of perverse things going on with NFTs, but there's also a lot of really beautiful, creative things. It might have been Sasha in the audience here who kind of analogized PFPs to kind of like modern portraiture. Not totally sure if that's attributable to you. So I think that's really fun reading. And I've definitely been part of PFP communities to some extent that like I think have a good sense of like, you know, genuine social camaraderie that's like not purely based in like, let's make the number go up. But yeah, it's not perfect. To answer your question directly, like I do think there are a lot of other things that you can do. Like you have the ability to create this kind of game space, you know, like you can control the rules. So the thing that I was first interested in is actually like, these are actually kind of decentralized like scores. You're creating a way of creating a rule set for participants to interact with each other. So it's actually kind of like a choreography that you're generating. So like, I think that's super interesting. A little bit more esoteric than a picture, but a lot of opportunities, I think.
Yeah, I think, you know, in general, just like the NFT space, I have been skeptical of, and I think previous to Forma being launched, purchased like 2 ever. But I think one of the things with community is that when you think about what community is from like a human aspect, is like just finding people who like the same thing that you like. And one of my critiques of like NFT and NFT communities is that the pictures were just a way to bond with people who liked the money going up. But I think when you have something that's like a sovereign space that's specifically for this, it can actually create a better sense of community. I find myself like excited when the next Forma launch is going to go, and I'd have like a rule for myself of like, I'm not going to buy all of them. I'm only going to pick the ones that I like. Because like, oh, I like this art, and you know, it's just, I haven't participated in like Discord and community like that, but it's cool when I talk to people and they're like, oh yeah, I liked that one too, and it's like it's just like it's a picture, I like it, and I bought it. And you know, where Sam says that like traditionally art has been this kind of very expensive thing, it's kind of for the wealthy. I appreciate that with the NFTs that are coming out, you can have an artist who still makes like a good wage off of something because they sell, you know, many copies of it and whatnot, but it's not having to labor to do it more times, and that so they get rewarded for the art that they're creating. But then also like we can have a group of people who have this and they can create this community. It's like, oh yeah, I like that art too. And just great way to find new people that you enjoy spending time with and have things in common with.
Yeah, I think it's pretty cool, like how each community forms like very differently. Like Monad, their art there is very different than like Cosmos with like Bad Kids, and then even Celestia sloths, like slightly different vibe than the Bad Kids of like the OG Cosmos. And then there's like the Solana, like with Mad Lads. Each community has a different vibe, different energy, different aesthetic even. I think like the way, like with more roll-ups coming out, each one's gonna start forming its own community like we talked about, like the cultural pluralism. Like Forma is inheriting a lot of like the Modular or Celestia energy and aesthetic with all those Forma launches there, because it's like curated by people in the Celestia community, which is pretty cool. And then stuff like Solana has their own type of art wave going on over there, and like memes, shitcoins going on. Monad has like their own like purple Pepe looking thing going on. Yeah, just like every single new chain coming out is forming a different identity, and I think that's what like the modular thesis is all about. It's really, I think it's pretty cool.
I think one of the like really refreshing things to me, just like even just being on this panel here, is we're talking about, and oftentimes in crypto, I'm sitting down and we're talking about MEV or, you know, value capture and who's doing this and who's getting front run and how are we going to make sure that, you know, anything, just kind of all this financialized aspect. But we're sitting here talking about art and communities, and you know, as a space where it's like I'm working on infra projects, but like the goal has always been like, how can we create a space that has like users doing things for things that like people not in crypto are interested in, and this is kind of that space. And there's aspects we could talk about that are, you know, more crypto space, but it's just refreshing to actually be at an event and be able to talk about like normal people problems and things that those people care about.
Yeah, just to, so it's not all like sunshine and roses with NFTs. Like even these major collections, I think it's a great starting place, but like what makes art interesting? Like why was I into it as a kid? Like Because it's a whole scene. Like, you do it with your friends, and you like learn stuff. You get exposed to new ideas. You go to events. It's like it's a whole world. And like NFTs, maybe you're in the Discord, or like they do feel very like shallow in like there is culture there, but like, you know, there's also the kind of this impetus to like, oh well, there is a kind of scarcity mindset, and like, well, why is it not like this like conduit for like creative potential and like inviting new artists in and like new ideas and new like ways of working, and like that's what the art is about, like is just doing cool shit with your friends. And I don't know, that feels like it's just really untapped in most cases.
I would actually disagree. Like in Cosmos, there was so much fragmentation for such a long time in Mindshare, and then like Bad Kids came out, and people started uniting around that art, forming their community around that. People from like 50 different Cosmos chains that normally disagree with each other, like formed around this one community, and that like usually with sovereignty and that comes with a bunch of fragmentation, but like the art with Bad Kids, even though it's just like a couple, like 10,000 drawings, like there's auto-generated drawings, like people came around that and started organizing around that, like around one singular vision for Cosmos. And I think that's like counterpoint to that.
One of the best examples for sure.
Yeah.
I think this kind of, one of the things that's interesting to me in this space is, you know, when we talk about NFTs, we usually talk about a collection and the community around that like particular collection. And one of the things that's interesting to me about Forma is that, and it's very new, so we'll see how this evolves over time, but it is multiple artists, and it's every week there's, you know, or not necessarily every week, but there are regular new drops of new artists, and the community isn't like, well, I bought this one collection. The community in this sovereign space can be, this is for people who like the art that is coming out of the space. And so I think you can have a little bit more of that, you know, traditional art community type thing, where it's not like, oh, I like this one and it has a, you know, a different hat or whatever. It can be a wholly unique, different art, and we can bond over, we like the art that's come out of one of these collections, as opposed to, you know, a single space. And having that sovereign space allows you to actually unite those and get more artists involved and get a lot of cool stuff out like that.
Yeah, I mean, let me push this out of the domain of NFTs, just to like give people some sense of this. Like, okay, there's an artwork on chain, or maybe it is a chain. Like, you do not get an object at the end. You do not start with an object. You actually just interact with the thing. Maybe other people interact with it as well, and you're just, you know, discovering something, like trying to understand what's going on with this social sculpture, as we were talking about the other day. That can be the art. Like, you can just engage in the performance. You can be a kind of participant in this collective behavior. There's a ton of super interesting things that you can do there, you know, NFTs, cool. They will absolutely be part of this world, and maybe there'll be a commemorative thing that's part of your interaction, or maybe not. Like, but thinking more expansively, I think that's what is exciting about this. Is like people tend to kind of consolidate around specific standards, artifacts, or whatever, and this is like specifically trying to push against that, and like, let's do something a little bit weird and experimental, and kind of some of it's going to blow up, and some of it'll be cool and like inspire the next thing.
Yeah, I mean, I did a talk earlier where stuff we talked about the other day as well, where I was sort of saying that we've conflated the object of the art with the artwork more broadly. That, I think, is a taxonomical, ontological issue. I think it's actually a lot of confusion around these things. We have this primitive that's an NFT, that's just, what it means is like object, and then we're saying, well, we do this thing with the objects. Like, well, what subjects be about? And Forma specifically was curated with the notion of what Nick Hamilton, who was the first artist we released on Forma, named the things he did as postcards, which I think is a really nice ontological anchoring, right? It's like cheap, you know, ubiquitous things that nonetheless carry some sort of memento value, right? I paid 50 cents and I was there, but that, to me, that sacrifice of the capital to me actually does say something, even if the price doesn't or whatever, you know. There's like something about presence and sort of arrangement community in a way that's not sort of, you know, starts from an affordable place. In the same way that postcards do, right? When you go to the museum and you buy a postcard, you don't think you're going to sell it in 2 years, but nonetheless, you're part of some sort of communion, conversation.
Yeah, it also draws on the history of mail art, which I can maybe say a word about, which is like there are very interesting artist communities. It's just kind of artist to artist, you know, peer to peer. Like I make a postcard, send it to you, and then that kind of inspires the next thing. Like artist sends it back, and this is kind of this like internal dialogue that happened with, you know, in similar way that people like find themselves in discords and whatever. It's like this kind of like informal conversation going on and like network that ends up forming. And those were not like monetized objects. They were just kind of like notes to each other and like kind of punctuate a larger art practice that you had, played a really important role in kind of social cohesion and movement formation and like that. So drawing on the kind of idea of a postcard artwork, you can go in a lot of pretty cool directions that maybe speak directly to artists or speak to collectors in a way that is a little bit out of the norm. Yeah.
That was kind of part of the scaffolding of Forma as well as an idea originally, was the notion of the fully on-chain metadata part was interesting, firstly because you have some, obviously some like trust assumptions that go away when you have more things on chain. But the interesting thing that I'm really excited to look what happens with is the notion that it's also composable. So any art piece that gets deployed on Forma can reference any other piece that gets deployed that's been deployed on Forma before, and any changes that happen sort of on any of them can affect other ones in a trustless, permissionless manner. Which sounds a lot actually like the net art you're describing. Like someone sends something and it changes over time and people sort of interact with it. To me, that's what an artchain proper would be something that's performative and long-term and mutates in various ways. And maybe it starts with little postcards but ends up being some amalgamation of interactions. And I think for that, you actually do need sovereign block space because you need the customers that come with it and the enshrinement of them in a social layer. That means people will actually use them and do things with them. So I'm hopeful for that, but let's see, we're not there yet. Maybe we'll all stop before that happens. Hopefully not. I have a separate question. I don't know if you guys want to. So on the one hand, you have the sort of this trajectory towards more blockchains, more sovereign communities that distance themselves and differentiate themselves in this sort of maybe insular pockets of block space, right? So that's one of the vision. And then the other sort of trajectory is happening now with like chain abstraction and bridging everything to everywhere all at once, kind of like, you know, disintermediates that and creates another layer on top, whatever you want to call it, different protocols have different names for it, where you actually don't know which chain you're on, right? And where you no longer feel like you're part of a separate community. I guess I want to ask you about that because you know, have a very big bridge. Whether or not you feel like these trajectories are mutually exclusive and they point in different directions, right? So the sovereignty of different communities, where you feel like you're in a different chain and maybe the bridging is part of the experience, right? I go somewhere else and I'm here now, and if I want to do anything else, I have to move from there and go somewhere else. Versus like the teleportation world that I think everyone's kind of building towards.
So are you talking about like in a world where everything is chain abstracted? Like, do we lose the sense of community everywhere?
Yeah.
That's a pretty good question. Yeah, I think maybe like some portion of people will always be aware of like the underlying blockchain. So they're still going to be like the hardcore like blockchain people that'll be interacting on chain. And then there's going to be like the abstracted layer above with like the general public that's like not as crypto pilled. Actually, like, I don't really have a good answer for that right now. Like, I think we're pretty far away from that, and maybe by the time we get there, like, each community is going to be big enough that it won't really matter. But yeah, I think that's a good question. I don't have a good answer right now.
I'm going to draw a big kind of simile here, which is a non-crypto question, which is, does making it easier for people to go around the world destroy world communities? Or does it? And the answer to that is, in some instances, like definitely yes. But it also, in some instances, provides access to people who don't have their own community in the space that they're stuck in, and can go and find that for themselves. And so I think we don't want to have the, I mean, it's a slightly tortured, analogy, but I think if we think about that as we create these interoperability layers and we create this chain abstraction and whatnot, we want to keep the best of what the communities are, but we also want to make it possible for people to move between everything and find the space that is correct for them. Just because your first time interacting on a blockchain was ETH, we don't want it to be this like super hard for you to go. It's like, but I noticed this stuff happening over here, but I couldn't figure out how to get my assets over there so that I could interact with it. We want to make sure that like you can have some of that interoperability and you can find the space that's correct for you. Even if where you first came on wasn't necessarily like the perfect spot. But we don't want to destroy the communities that exist while doing that. And I think that's down to an extent, it's like a human problem of how do we make sure that we as people are good in that regard.
I'm not totally convinced that we've kind of arrived at the correct interaction paradigm for blockchains, to be honest. Like, if you look at if you kind of analogize to the history of hypertext, like hypertext started as like a literary medium, first of all. It was kind of like literally hypertext. Like, how do you build nonlinear textual representations? And there's a big emphasis on link structure and your ability to kind of move between different applications, and a lot of emphasis on like contextual awareness and kind of like a lived experience of like going from here to here to here to here. And I don't see like any of that in blockchain. It's like bridges are like just the whole notion of a bridge is just like weird. Like a link is not like a place that you go. Like you travel through it, and you go to the thing that you're trying to go to. It's a conduit to get you somewhere. So we haven't like really gotten to that thing, and I feel like understanding what that navigation paradigm looks like and what the kind of like the points that you arrive at, the way that you get there, is pretty important for understanding like what an application is when you arrive. So yeah, I think that if you have the ability for like artchains to interact with each other, maybe you can do some experimentation here where you can actually create some relationality between the artworks. Sorry, there's a. I'll conclude there.
You talked about different artchains interacting with each other. I think that's a pretty interesting idea. How would that work if we have like 15 different artchains in the future, like 50? Like, how would that work? How do you think that would work? Instead of like having all that art on one chain, like this is back to the idea of sovereignty and having that like monolithic build.
Yeah, I'm going to pull us back to being a little bit more nerdy and here, because I think Astria provides a pretty like interesting future world here for us, which is that when you think about like these art chains interacting, it's up to the communities to decide what other communities they want to work with. And so Astria has built this, the sequencing layer is such that I say to an extent, you can kind of think of an execution engine on top of that as like a materialized view, or it's a filter function of some portion of the data, and you get to pick what portion of the data you actually want to use. And so you start as saying, I want only this chain's data, and someone else has I want only this, but then you say, actually we both want to have some interoperability, and we can consume parts of each other's data. And one of the things from like a coordination aspect here in like a very nerdy sort of way is that what you get via using this sequencing layer is that you get a shared like wall clock time, and it's just like coming to consensus on time is relatively difficult. It can say we did these things at the same time, the same block, and it provides some functionality there that can be used with other tools that people are building. Like Skip has a really great way for you to bridge between different chains and just like not be aware of what's happening under the hood. Great experience. But I think this is going to provide for ways that you can build that interoperability. It's not going to be, oh, all 15 art chains are going to work with each other and say this community wants to integrate with this community, and this one might want to actually work with like 3 others, and you can kind of have this composability and as a sovereign space, choose who you want to interact with.
That's a great, the filtering execution environment, it's a very interesting heuristic actually. Can I just ask, how do you choose, like is like a fork? Like how do you choose who you interact with in that case? Who chooses? The community is depending on whatever? Yeah,
this is up to, it's a fork choice rule of the rollup, what data they're going to pull. And we have ideas on this in terms of, broader outside of just kind of the community art space and kind of evolving. To start with, you have to make it such that you can have one, and then figuring out it's designed for the future to have this, but, to be determined entirely how it works out. And this is to the point of iteration, is people will test things and see what works. And if one version doesn't, then you can go back. And this is the other cool thing about running on top of a sequencer. If you like try something with your execution environment, you're like, oh, it didn't work, but I'm like my own sovereign space. You can then be like, actually, we're just like traditional like tech type thing, like roll back. And you can test it out in kind of a test net space. Just make sure that everything executes and it works, and it seems like a nice user interaction. And then if your experiment doesn't work, just be like, no, let's keep doing what we were doing before.
Great. Wow. Couple minutes to go. Maybe be nice to do a boring thing and just ask all of you what you're excited about. And if it's artchain-y or RT related, that's great. If it's not, then that's fine as well. But just the way to close it off. One thing that excites you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just excited for more experimentation. I'm excited for more artists to get paid to do their work. Is one of the reasons I got into this space. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for artists to, a lot of the talk this week has been around just nobody wants to use blockchains because they're like boring. There's a lot of potential there to engage artists directly and like give them some agency to do some creative work. So excited for that.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be a little bit boring here because I more from like a traditional Web 2 background. I'm excited for seeing, yes, new innovation, but I have this kind of radical idea that you can use a sequencing layer to run not a blockchain on top of, and you can have an interaction that is persistent. You get the benefits of having verifiable data posted in a blockchain while running like a normal, you just have some sequenced data application on top of it. And I think that's going to be, maybe not now, but like 10 years from now, like a powerful way to do some like essentially just database technology.
Yeah, I'm excited for, I guess like in a world with like 1,000, 10,000 different sovereign communities, having something to unite around and build around and coordinate around, something like art, like profile pictures even, like Bad Kids, like the example we said earlier. Just art as a unifying force for all these different fragmented communities.
Great. That's what we have time for. Thank you guys so much for this. Really appreciate it. Yeah.